Anyway, I want to also bring into the conversation at this point Tia Nelson, who is the daughter of Senator Gaylord Nelson, someone who saw firsthand that very important friendship, both between the two men, Gaylord Nelson and George McGovern, but also between two families. Tia, welcome to A Public Affair.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you here. If we could, just you were reflecting, I think, on memories going back to being a small child about George McGovern. I think one of the points that some folks were making is the Nixon administration in '72 had him painted as someone who was very aloof, very hard to connect with the average person. But I know your experience of him was quite different from that, was it not?
Well, George was an incredibly warm person and shared a lot of characteristics that really defined the type of man he was. He shared a lot of characteristics with my father. They were both small-town boys born during the Depression with Midwestern values. They were incredibly kind and humble, and they also, as it happens, both had great sense of humor. They were both war veterans who went on to oppose the Vietnam War as an unjust and unwinnable enterprise. They were elected the same year, defeated the same year. They dedicated their lives to the causes. After they left the Senate, they dedicated their lives to the causes that they had worked so hard on while in the Senate. In my father's case, conservation issues at the Wilderness Society, and in George's case, alleviating world hunger. But I can't think of anybody who was sweeter and kinder and more affable than George. He just had a remarkable warmth to him. And I heard Bill mention earlier in the show that he wasn't sure whether George and my father had met in the Senate or at any time prior to that. I had coincidentally spoken about this very question with my mother recently, and it turns out, according to my mom's recollection, that Hubert Humphrey, who was a friend and admirer of both my father and George, who were a little bit younger than he and up-and-coming politicians. George was a congressman in South Dakota, and my father was governor. And apparently they were introduced at that time while Papa was governor and George was congressman. I believe that's correct. And so Humphrey introduced them. And then, to think of it, decades later, all of us lived within a mile of each other. George and Humphrey lived across the street from each other, and we lived not too far away. Some of us going to school with each other's kids and so on. But I think that the impression that the public impression of Senator McGovern was not at all like the experience that those of us who knew him had in our time. And it was, this went on. My parents' relationship with the McGoverns lasted nearly 50 years. So while I met him and remember him quite fondly as a young person, I knew him all of my life. And until my father's last days, they were best of friends. And still pretty much the small-town boys from Wisconsin and South Dakota that they'd been defined as in their young years.
And it sounds like a real parallel, as you mentioned, after the 1980 Reagan Revolution, where 9 progressive senators, including your father and Senator McGovern, lost re-election. But both men remain vital well into their later years. Your father working, of course, on so many levels with environmental issues, Senator McGovern in combating world hunger, including efforts with Senator Bob Dole. Again, that isn't always the case when someone leaves office. They want to take a respite, take a break away from social justice and other compelling issues, but certainly wasn't the case with either of them, was it?
It wasn't, and interestingly enough, they both certainly would have had ample opportunity to cash in on their stature and name recognition and made good money And they both rejected that path. And my father thought of his years that followed his Senate years, his years at the Wilderness Society, as among the most rewarding in his life. I know that George felt the same way about his work on world hunger. 10 years or so ago, was director of the Climate Change Initiative for the Nature Conservancy, and I had gone to Rome to the Food and Agricultural Organization and to a meeting looking at the risks that climate change posed for agricultural production and forestry health. And when that meeting wrapped up, I went over to George's office, and we had a lovely lunch on his terrace, and he was energetic about his opportunity there as special ambassador to FAO to work on the issues that had motivated him in much of his public life, and he recognized that climate change, its greatest impact was going to be on the poor and developing countries, and these were issues that he was passionate about, as my father was passionate about the environment, and they had a chance to cash in and not pursue the path they did. But my father worked till months before the day he passed away. He was 89 years old. Said the job wasn't done, and that's why he continued to go to work when retirement would have been easier. And George was exactly the same way, working until you had that earlier interview from him, and working every day and as long as he was able before his passing on the causes that motivated him to dedicate his life to public service. And in that regard, he and my father were very much the same men.
Tia, thank you so much for sharing those memories, and we're very pleased to know that both you and Bill Christopherson will also be joining us for this celebration of George McGovern's life.